Did you know that Sonic the Hedgehog appears in Crusader of Senti? Crusader of Senti is an action-adventure game developed by Next Tech for the Sega Genesis. The story centers around Corona, a boy who just turned 14 years of age and must inherit his late father's sword to fight the monsters that threaten the human race's existence. To me, this game looks like a classic Zelda clone, but in the game, you can actually find Sonic the Hedgehog lounging on a little beach chair in this little oasis. He says, "Tis tis, I'm a gallant hedgehog. Don't mess or you'll get burned." For whatever reason, Sonic has no patience, but he's hanging out, you know, that's what Sonic does. Let's move on to the next game. The next game where Sonic has a cameo on the list is Valkyria Chronicles 2, which was for the PlayStation Portable. It was a tactical role-playing game set in the middle of some war. There was a tank with artwork of Sonic from Sonic Channel. Not the most subtle cameo, but certainly one nonetheless. Let's move on to the next one. The next game on the list is called Transform Ice. This was a browser game, and in the shop, players were able to buy hats with quills that were shaped like Sonic and Shadow, and there was a skin based on Tails. There's also an achievement title in the game called Sonic the Mouse. This is a very interesting online flash game, but let's move on to the next one. The next game on the list is Scott Pilgrim vs. the World, the game. It's a side-scrolling beat-em-up game based on the popular comic book series and film. One of the power-ups in the game that you can obtain is called Speedy the Porcupine. There's also a cheat code in the game that is the same exact code for the level select in Sonic the Hedgehog 3, which is up, up, down, down, up, 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 up. And not only that, there was a re-release of this game a couple years later on the Nintendo Switch. And if you look right here, there's actually a pose that parodies Sonic's iconic pose from Sonic Adventure. Or maybe it's just a giant coincidence, right? Yeah, I don't think so. Let's move on to the next one. The next game on the list is Fun Run. I don't know if anyone remembers this game, but this was an extremely popular iPhone game from back in the day where you could race against your friends online. It truly was revolutionary for mobile gaming at the time, but in this game, there is a slight nod to Sonic the Hedgehog, because in this game, players can purchase an item called Sanic, spelled S-A-N-I-K, that looks just like Sonic's shoes. I mean, they're basically identical. If you haven't played this game, or if you remember this game, I probably just unlocked the core memory. Let's move on to the next one. The next game in the list is Farm Hawk Arena. This was a mobile farming game, which, you know, back in the day was like a super popular genre. You think of games like Farmville, which probably even had your grandma as a player on Facebook. However, this game did have a Sonic version in 2012. As Sonic, players can run around and even take a nap, as you can see in the bottom right corner. And there's really not much footage or anything known about this game, but still interesting nonetheless. The next game on the list is Hatsune Miku Project Diva. In celebration of Sonic's 20th anniversary, Hatsune Miku has a Sonic the Hedgehog costume. There's also some Sonic the Hedgehog loading screen artwork as well in this game. Believe it or not, Hatsune Miku wearing the Sonic costume was actually illustrated by legendary artist Yuji Uekawa as well. The game was originally for the PSP. Let's move on to the next one. The next game on the list is Spiral Knights, which was an MMORPG created by Sega and 3 Rings, where players would defeat enemies as robotic knights. Metal Sonic has his own costume in the game for people who purchased a copy of Sonic CD on Steam. The costume was also available for in-game purchase in the time as well. There was also an accessory for Tails' as well. As you can tell by the gameplay, it seems like it has some hack and slash elements. It has some pretty simple gameplay. The costumes are pretty cool because they're not necessarily one-to-one copies, but more so inspiration. But let's move on to the next one. The next game on the list is Samurai and Dragons, which is a free-to-play, card-based strategic fighting game developed by Sega. So, you know, no surprise that there's a Sonic collab in the game as well. In late 2012, Samurai and Dragons Deluxe Package was released, and it also contained some Sonic the Hedgehog themed cards as well. We gotta look at our boy Shadow. We had Sonic. We also have Dr. Eggman, and there's even a Chao card. How great is that? Let's move on to the next game. Next game on the list is Dengekai Bunko Fighting Climax, which was released in 2014. And you'll notice in the background some Chao. You'll also see Knights from Nights into Dreams, but you'll also see Sonic floating around in the background as well. But this isn't the only Sonic themed appearance in this game. There's also a Green Hill based stage in the game, which is actually based off of its appearance in Sonic Generations. But come on, you can't talk about Sonic without talking about Green Hill. Sonic fans everywhere are probably complaining about this, but let's move on to the next game. The next game on the list is Monster Hunter 4 Ultimate. This was a game released for the 3DS, and you also notice that they had Mario and Luigi collabs, but also, interestingly enough, they had a Sonic and the Black Knight themed Sonic skin. The coolest part about all this is that the DLC was actually released in 2014, so it's interesting that they actually based it off of the game years prior, but definitely still cool nonetheless. This wasn't also the last collab that Monster Hunter and Sonic did. As a bonus, a couple of years ago, there was a Monster Hunter Rise collab with Sonic the Hedgehog. Monster Hunter is a Capcom-owned franchise, and basically in the game, you have to like hunt down certain monsters with your friends, and the game in of itself is pretty cool. They had this extremely cursed Tails mount. They have some Sonic-themed skins, but they also have this like mini Sonic in the game as well. I gotta say, the little costume definitely does look pretty cool. The game also features some statues, as you can see right there, and even a supersonic transformation. We also can't forget that there was a Monster Hunter DLC collab in Sonic Frontiers as well. So Capcom and Sega have a good working relationship with each other. Very unique and interesting collabs, but let's move on to the next one. The next game on the list is Monster Super League, which was a 2016 free-to-play mobile RPG. In 2019, there was a Sonic collab where you could be characters like Sonic, you could be Tails, Silver the Hedgehog, and of course, the man, myth, the legend, Shadow the Hedgehog. It's got some turn-based combat. It's basically like Sonic, but in a Raid Shadow Legends type game. And speaking of Raid Shadow Legends, today's video is brought to you by... I'm just kidding, but yo, tell me I didn't just get you right there. Like, tell me that was not the perfect transition. Let's move on to the next game, though. Next up on the list is Persona 5 Dancing in Starlight, which is a spin-off rhythm game featuring the central cast from Persona 5. There was one of the characters in the game that had a weird, creepy little Sonic costume, as you can see right here. So, yeah, let's move on to the next one. He's freaking me out. Another cool cameo you may or may not have known is that Sonic was actually featured in a Pac-Man game. Well, this might not be as obscure because I'm sure a lot of you guys are familiar with some of these mobile collabs, but there was a mobile port of Pac-Man and Sonic actually did a little collab, and you could actually play as Sonic in the game with like a Sonic themed Pac-Man skin kind of thing. He was also playable in Sonic Dash as well, so it was kind of like a crossover. Not as obscure, but let's move on to the next one. The next game on the list is Sega Slots, which was a Vegas-style gambling app that employs the use of well-known Sega franchises, hiding a children's mascot behind gambling. How sick and evil! There was some Sonic-themed levels in the game, which kind of reminds me of Sonic Dash a little bit, but they were able to turn gambling into a Sonic theme. It's made by Sega, so it's not that crazy, but let's move on to the next game. The next game on the list is Bubsy the Woolly Strike Back. In the launch trailer of this game, you will actually see Bubsy answering the door to a kid in a Sonic the Hedgehog costume. This game released in 2017 for the PlayStation 4, Nintendo Switch, and PC. What do you think of the Sonic cosplay? The game in of itself was like a standard 2D platformer type game with some pretty cool visuals. But let's move on to the next game. The next game on the list is Dragon City, a game that originally released in 2012 for Facebook, of course, iOS, and Android. I mean, this just looks like a Facebook game. During its Video Game Island event in 2017, there was a dragon modeled after Sonic. You could do a cool little spin dash in the game. And you know, the Blue Bolt Dragon, or Sonic, or whatever you want to call him, does look kind of cool, but also at the same time, extremely cursed. Let's move on to the next game. The next game on the list where Sonic has a surprise cameo is, surprisingly enough, Super Mario Maker. Who would have thought the first time Sonic and Mario also appear in a platformer together? If the player has the Sonic amiibo, you can unlock the ability to gain a mystery mushroom, which will allow you to transform into Sonic. He has his signature spin dash ability, but you can only play as Sonic if you're playing in the NES version of the game. Would be pretty cool to see him in like the new Super Mario Bros. Style, but this is just about as close as we'll get to Sonic and Mario being in a platforming game together, unfortunately, unless Sega and Nintendo want to fix that and make the world right. But let's move on to the next one. The next game where Sonic appears in a non-Sonic game is Yoshi's Woolly World. Not shown on the screen right here. This is Sonic Lost World, which had a Yoshi DLC. Due to the Sonic Lost World Wii U exclusivity deal, of course there is going to be some Nintendo collabs. Once again, if you had this amiibo, there's a funny little Sonic the Hedgehog Yoshi skin that you can unlock in the game, which kind of resembles him with the shoes and the iconic blue silhouette. There's also a bunch of other collabs too in this game, so it's not really that crazy, but nonetheless, still a random Sonic cameo. Let's move on to the next one. The next game where Sonic has a cameo is Mario Kart 8, which, you know, in my opinion is one of the greatest games ever made. But there's a Sonic amiibo costume, again, the use of the amiibo with Nintendo, that gives you a little Sonic costume. It's not as cool as, you know, actually being Sonic in the game. Maybe one day Sonic will be playable in Mario Kart, but this will suffice. Let's move on to the next game. Cameos in other games without talking about the LEGO Dimensions Sonic the Hedgehog DLC. This was a LEGO-themed Sonic game that was extremely faithful to the source material. Some argue that this is actually one of the best Sonic games ever made. Look at Green Hill right here. Of course, Green Hill's in the game. We got the iconic Sonic 2 special stages, a remake of Emerald Coast. I mean, it really doesn't get much better than this. We have a Death Egg robot boss battle. The English cast is voicing all the characters in the game. One of the coolest things about this game also is that it was developed by Traveler's Tale. Now, if you know what Traveler's Tales is, they were the original developers of Sonic R. So it's pretty cool to see that almost 20 years later, they got a second crack at making a Sonic the Hedgehog game. And one of the coolest things about it is that it's actually good. We could gush about it more and more and maybe make a separate video about it, maybe do a playthrough. Well, let's move on to the next game. The next game on the list, of course, is Super Monkey Ball Banana Blitz HD, which came out in 2019. One of the characters that was introduced into the game was a playable Sonic the Hedgehog. Obviously, this is a Sega-made game, so it's really not that surprising, again, to see Sonic in the game. And most people know about this, but hey, listen, it's a Sonic appearance in a non-Sonic Sonic game. Let's move on to the next one. The next game that has a Sonic the Hedgehog reference is actually Grand Theft Auto 5. So one of the stores, if you look right here, says Super Sonic, the ultra fast ring specialist. I mean, who goes Super Sonic, who's ultra fast, and who collects rings? It's none other than Sonic, okay? The next game where Sonic had a cameo in was Angry Birds Epic. Now, this isn't the new Angry Birds collab. If you look right here, Sonic the Hedgehog was playable for a cross-promotion event in Angry Birds that wanted to cross-promote Sonic Dash, and it was like a turn-based RPG game. They had some Seaside Hill level themes. Obviously, they had Sonic in the game. Sonic was also playable in Angry Birds 2 during this time. And as you know, in the modern day, Sega purchased the Angry Birds franchise, and there was more collabs, but we'll get into that in another episode.